Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello, this is Czechast, where we explore the people, places and stories that make Czechia so unique. I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and as we are getting near to the 35th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, I thought it would be interesting to speak to someone who experienced the time and atmosphere in Prague before the end of communism and after it happened. Mark Baker is an American journalist and travel writer. He first arrived in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, and his entry into Prague was quite an adventure.
I got separated from my roommate, Matt, and we were separated for 3 days. It was just a hotel screw-up in the end. But I didn't see him for 3 days, and I had no idea what happened to him at that time, and he had no idea what happened to me at that time. So it was a very weird kind of Kafkaesque moment where some very small bureaucratic slip-up actually separated us, and he ended up reporting me to the U.S. Embassy as a missing person. So that was my very first entry into Prague.
Mark then worked as a journalist in Vienna, and his reporting often brought him to Prague, which was then the capital of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. As he found out much later, he was closely monitored by the communist secret police. And the Intercontinental Hotel in Pařížská Street, now officially Fairmont Golden Hotel, was full of honey traps.
So when I stayed at the Intercontinental, I wrote in my book that the lobby, of course, was filled with women, attractive women, more
surprisingly attractive women
surprisingly
by the bar, yeah.
more attractive.
Single,
yes, exactly.
alone.
More available and single and attractive than I've ever seen since then, in this country. I mean, in a sense. So it always struck me as like, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on. Of course, I was in my 20s at the time, still a little bit naive.
But then came the 1990s, when Prague was buzzing with life and possibility. Thousands of foreigners flocked to the city, drawn by the coolness of the city itself and Václav Havel's leadership. Here is how Mark describes that unique time.
Thousands of foreigners were coming in, because Prague was so cool, because Havel was so cool, because it was so interesting to be here. So it went from being distressed about what's happening to the state of the Velvet Revolution and its survival, Gorbachev's coup in 1991. Another thing, it's like, wow, this might not last. I mean, it looks like it's going to, but it could be rolled back. To the other side, a happy, crazy place, San Francisco of the 1990s, somehow, lots of people just hanging out, doing basically nothing, having fun.
So, this is Czechast, I'm Vít Pohanka, the host, and in today's episode, Mark Baker shares more of his memories from that vibrant era and reflects on how much Prague has changed in the past few decades.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Here we are in Prague. Where are we? And who are you? And why are we standing here?
I don't know why we're standing here. We're standing at the Metronome in the Letna Gardens, and it's a beautiful, beautiful day. So we got very lucky for this interview. And my name is Mark Baker, and I am being interviewed for your podcast. You'll tell me what reason I'm being interviewed.
I will definitely tell you. Let's just walk around a little bit.
Okay, sure.
As the listeners can find out, you already spoke to my colleague Ian Willoughby back in 2021 about
correct.
Your guide to Prague.
Right.
Let me ask you about this. How did you, as someone who studied at Columbia University,
right.
I understand,
Yes.
how did you, get connected to Prague and to this part of Europe?
I decided to study at Columbia. I decided to study in their Eastern and Central European Institute. I don't really know why I chose that, but this division in Europe, this sort of artificial division in Europe, always struck me as really fascinating. I started Columbia in 1983 and graduated in 1986. So we're talking about mid-1980s. And my very first trip to Prague was in 1984, so it was during that period at Columbia. I was visiting my roommate, my college roommate at the time, who was studying Polish language in Krakow. We spent some time in Poland, and then both of us came over on the train in August of 1984 during our summer break.
And that's how you came to Czechoslovakia?
That's my first visit of Czechoslovakia, and the first time I actually ever saw Prague in person. And of course, it was beautiful, an amazing city, a little quieter than it is now, not nearly as many tourists. In fact, almost zero tourists as far as I remember. But one really funny thing happened to me during that trip, and it always stayed with me, and maybe it had something to do with the reason why I decided to live in Prague. I got separated from my roommate, Matt. And we were separated for 3 days. It was just a hotel screw-up in the end. But I didn't see him for 3 days, and I had no idea what happened to him at that time, and he had no idea what happened to me at that time. So it was a very weird kind of Kafkaesque moment where some very small bureaucratic slip-up actually separated us, and he ended up reporting me to the U.S. Embassy as a missing person. So that was my very first entry into Prague. And
so what did the embassy do? I mean, did they contact the Czech, veřejná bezpečnost?
No, at the end, it was this. The hotel put Matt in one room and put me in another room and didn't tell us that they had put us in separate rooms, even though we had booked a double room. We were students, we were trying to save money. And so that was it. So we were staying in the same hotel for 3 days at the same time, but we never knew it. We just thought, and the hotel still exists today. It's in Strašnica. It was called the Hotel Solidarita at the time. This was 1984, so that name would have meant something back then because of the Polish...
Like Solidarność?
Yes, like Solidarność in Polish. So that name really did mean something. Of course, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to stay there. It seemed like a cool idea at the time, and we were just coming from Krakow. So anyway, of course, we had decided we were going to meet. We had pre-planned to meet at the train station to take the train to Germany. We both had tickets to Nuremberg on the overnight train. So we met at the train station and we were both fine. Nothing had happened to us. So it was a really weird screw-up.
It's a kind of weird situation, but you both came from Krakow?
Yes.
On the same train?
Yes,
or?
We both arrived in Prague on the train. We went to Čedak, a room finding service, which was mandatory for foreigners at the time. We got the room at the Solidarity, a twin-bed double room in the Hotel Solidarita. Matt went back to the room, or rather I went back to the room. Matt stayed out to walk around and see the sights. When I went back to the hotel, they put me in one room. When Matt came back later, they put him in another room. So I spent like 3 days writing him messages and giving him to the receptionist, like, Matt, where are you? Where are you? Please give me a sign. I thought maybe he met some party, met some girl, whatever. Why is he not coming back? Yeah. And
this will sound probably quite strange to my children who grew up with cell phones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We didn't have any cell phones
at
that time.
It would never have happened.
There was no way to contact each other.
I would have texted him immediately and saying, where are you? Come on, dude, we're doing this together.
But were they, trying to, isolate you? Were they trying not to?
I don't think so. It was
just a
student.
mix-up.
We were both students at Columbia University. We had no threat whatsoever to the regime. We were just there to have fun, basically. So it was just a mix-up. I didn't mind at the time because I had met a woman in Krakow at the time, Božena, girl student, and she, by coincidence, was coming to Prague at the same time that we would be here.
She was a Czech woman?
She was Polish.
She was Polish.
Božena. Yes, so it was a total coincidence. So they were actually staying with a bunch of Polish students for the Polish-Czechoslovak Friendship Society or something like that. Hundreds of Polish students were there in that August at the Strahov dormitories, in Prague.
I see.
6.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
Strahov dormitories, just for the listeners, this is like kind of a big complex which was especially big before 1989.
Yes.
Where a lot of students, especially from technical university, I think, stayed, etc.
Yes.
It's a big student hostel complex.
And this was the summertime, so it was empty, and so it was the perfect place to host this kind of Polish-Czechoslovak friendship group. Really hundreds of Czechs and Poles hanging around drinking beer. what could go wrong? Anyway, so I didn't really care too much about Matt at the time because I was more interested in going to see Božena at the Strahov dorm. Like meet up with her and see what she was doing. I wanted to hang out with my roommate, of course, and it really bothered me when he didn't show up for all that time, and started to gnaw on me, like, really, what's happening? What am I going to tell his parents? All that stuff, and I was genuinely worried about him. But of course, I had other things on my mind as well at that time, and I wasn't thinking completely about that.
So you met at the train station going to Nuremberg, right?
Yes, yeah. We met after on the third day. We had prearranged to meet on the train station, the 8 o'clock train at that time to Nuremberg. And that's what we did. Of course, he was exceptionally angry at me, like, where the hell were you? What were you doing? I looked all over for you. I reported you to the embassy as missing. And I was like, well, where the hell were you? I was there 3 days waiting for you, and you never showed up. So, you asked me a little bit about my first experience in Prague, and I had a genuinely Kafkaesque experience for my first time here.
Very Kafkaesque, but from the interview that you did for Radio Prague International a few years back,
yes,
I understand that you then started working as a journalist from Vienna.
Yes.
And you had another, I suppose, Kafkaesque experience as well.
Yes.
In Czechoslovakia.
Yes. So that this 1984 experience in Prague put me in the mood to study more about Czechoslovakia. And if you go back to the 80s,
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. So you
Sure.
were 1984. You were in Prague, and then you finished your studies.
Yeah, I went back to New York, graduated in 1986, and then that same year, 1986, I was hired to work as a journalist in Vienna. By a company called Business International that would later become acquired by The Economist Group, which owns The Economist magazine. So I was doing kind of double duty there, working for that, but working for all those organizations. But the main thing about this country is that they gave me the Czechoslovak portfolio in the office.
Why did they do that? Because you had been to Czechoslovakia?
I don't know. I really don't know.
They probably just needed to fill in the position.
Yes. There was a guy who spoke good German, of course, and wanted to do East Germany, and I had been originally slated to be the East German correspondent because I also speak German. And then my boss said, well, let's let the old guy, excuse me if he's listening, let's let the other guy, that's better, let's let the other guy have it, and then you'll just do Czechoslovakia. So I slotted into that, knowing very few words of Czech. At Columbia, we did not even have a Czech language instruction.
Did you learn Russian? I don't know.
I learned Polish. Yes, I was at Columbia because of the excitement about solidarity and about what was happening. It seemed like that was the
we should definitely put it into context. I mean, this was the time when the solidarity trade unions movement was huge.
Right. I do remember in the mid-1980s, Solidarity and Poland were the change agents in Central Europe. Yeah. So we were all encouraged to study that. I learned a lot about Polish history, and then I was encouraged to get into Polish language. So I had, some of that. But in Vienna, no, I had to learn on the fly Czech. But Czech is not a language that you learn on the fly normally.
No. It's quite difficult. Right?
It is difficult. So so the company I was working for, they hired a translator naturally and a fixer. All journalists require fixers. They do very important things like make your hotel reservations and drive you around in their car. And my fixer was named Arnold. He was a man of about 60 years old, a Czech of Sudeten origin, which explains the name Arnold. German Sudeten. Arnold. Not a common name in Czechoslovakia at all. So that was my translator and fixer. And on many occasions I would come up to Prague to do my ordinary reporting work, which was to try to talk to ministers or the leaders of Czechoslovak companies and learn about what their priorities were for buying goods and services from the West. I mean, it sounds very dull, but that was my job, basically, as an economics correspondent. And Arnold was integral in that whole thing.
And we will get to Arnold. Just for the listeners to explain, I mean, there's some construction work going on, and there's the background noise. Before we get to Arnold, let me just ask you, I mean, because when you started working here, it was already Gorbachev in power in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And there was a talk of perestroika and glasnost and everything. But we in Czechoslovakia, as I remember that, I was a student then, we thought, well, things are probably moving faster in Russia than they are moving here.
How ironic. Yeah.
What was it like? I mean, did you sense any kind of feeling that Czechoslovakia was then, already thinking of coming closer to, I don't know, the capitalist West, at least economically, if not kind of ideologically?
The Cold War was changing under our feet in a sense, but we didn't. When I say we, I'm talking about nearly everyone who studied this region, didn't sense it exactly or how quickly it might be moving. When I started at Columbia, we were talking about, Brezhnev had recently passed away. The Soviet Union went into a succession crisis, basically, with 2 or 3 candidates before they finally settled on Gorbachev. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan were in power. So we're talking about the height of the Cold War, martial law in Poland. So I went to Vienna with that mentality in my mind. Like, these are 2 blocks. They're going to be separate in Europe for the rest of my life. There's not really nothing I can do about it, even if I wanted to, or anyone else could. The only thing that we should do is to, do our jobs, is to try to accept this division and to report on what we had to report on. So I think, in a sense, since we were all grounded in that more harsher reality of the Cold War, that we were very slow to acknowledge that actual change was happening.
And it was happening, wasn't it?
It was happening, but I remember in 1985 and 1986, when Gorbachev first rose to prominence in the Soviet Union, we would debate in Vienna on and on about whether he's just a good PR candidate for a very harsh regime, or whether he genuinely wants to implement reform. And if he wants to implement reform, what's he really talking about? What is economic restructuring and more transparency? It just sounds very buzzwordy. So I have to say that we didn't take it all that seriously, to our regret, perhaps, looking at the way things worked out.
But in Czechoslovakia, obviously we still had Husak, for the president. No. We still had the same government, like there was.
Vít, let me tell you, when I was at Columbia, no one encouraged me to study Czechoslovakia because, sure, we had Milan Kundera, he was a great writer, and we had Václav Havel, he's a very interesting guy. But Prague was a client state of Moscow.
Yeah.
Husak and Jákos and all those guys, they did whatever they were told. And it was actually from an academic, from a historical standpoint, Czechoslovakia was not a very interesting. It was not interesting compared to some of the other countries, but it was not interesting. So yes, Czechoslovakia was a relatively hardline state. I would put it in the same league as East Germany. Perhaps not as crazy as Ceausescu in Romania, but in that same group, if you want to look at the Eastern Bloc as groups.
Definitely true. Yet, in 1989, and now I'm making a bit of a jump here, let me mention this. I actually was ill at the beginning of November 1989. I was at home, but I was listening to BBC World Service, which wasn't jammed anymore.
Right.
I was listening to the English broadcast.
Yeah.
And the Berlin Wall fell. And there was like, oh gosh, should I go there right now?
Right.
Escape? Or should I wait? Because in Czechoslovakia nothing was still happening. And I'm talking literally a few days before the 17th of November 1989.
Yes.
Nobody expected that, right?
Well, right before the Berlin Wall fell, of course, for about 4 weeks before, there were enormous protests in East Germany. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
In Leipzig.
Neue Forum.
In Neue Forum. Yeah, exactly. And
the new forum.
The new forum in East Berlin and in Leipzig. And so my company actually sent me to Prague on November 4th, I believe it was, something like that, November 5th.
To find out what the people think here.
Yes, exactly. To come to Prague and ask people, of course, with Arnold doing my asking for me, nobody was willing to talk to me at all. But the people who were willing to talk to me said, of course, what's going on in East Berlin is fascinating. We watch it every day, but it will not happen here in Prague. It's not going to happen here in Prague. And there was that collective belief, maybe it's a fatalistic part of Czech society or culture, that, good things weren't going to happen to this country, in that sense. So I saw the same thing you did when I was here in Prague. It was dead as a doornail in a sense, except for all the East Germans who were coming through Prague, to get their
the whole story of August 1989 when they camped at the West German embassy.
Yes, and there was another wave that came through in November of 1989, if you remember, like the second or the third wave of that exodus, and they were getting their, bus tickets or train tickets or whatever to go to West Germany to start their new lives. That was exciting.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Hans Dietrich Genscher came here to Prague and he kind of negotiated the release.
Yes,
didn't he?
yes.
Yeah.
And as soon as he negotiated that, God, we should have known. It's over. It's over. Because if people can just come to Prague and then go to West Germany, what's going to keep them in East Germany if they want to leave? You know, I mean, that's not a significant barrier.
So you were, if I understand correctly, you were visiting Prague every now and then from 1986.
Yes.
Coming here from Vienna.
Yes.
And meeting your fixer Arnold.
Yes, meeting Arnold. Yeah.
So who was he? Who was Arnold?
Well, okay, I was a journalist, and I still, had my, still had, I still had a lot to learn. And Arnold was my helper, my fixer, as I told you. And my translator, my Czech language wasn't good enough to interview any type of minister or anything like that, and to get something meaningful out of that person.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt you here. Did you get to ministers, or did you get to
yes, we did.
Members of the government?
Yes, there were very few Western publications and outlets that were reporting. Mm-hmm. So when one of us came through, I was working at that time for the Economist Group. It had a huge name. People wanted to meet me, and it was great. It was nice to be able to be lifted up on the back of that name. So I met the Minister of Foreign Trade, and very, people that were heading the foreign trade organizations. The head of Chemipol, or the head of Strojimport. These are communist-era holding companies that did a lot of trade. So
in the West and in Africa, all over the world.
I had great access. They always put me up in the Intercontinental Hotel, which at the time was the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme. Yes, so I had good access.
Intercontinental.
This one over here.
Yes, that's the one across.
Yes,
across
still one of my favorite hotels to think about and consider and remember, because of all the crazy stuff that happened in that hotel.
It must have been full of microphones, I would think, full of agents, no?
Well...
Am I wrong? I don't know.
It's funny because, yes, we all realized when we traveled in this part of the world, we all realized that we were going to be monitored, we were going to be reported on. It just went with the territory. But if you tried to keep your nose clean, what bad could happen to you? That was the thinking there. So when I stayed at the Intercontinental, I wrote in my book that the lobby, of course, was filled with women, attractive women, more
surprisingly attractive women sitting by the bar,
more attractive.
Single,
yes, exactly. More available and single and attractive than I've ever seen since then. In this country. In a sense. So it always struck me as like, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on. Of course, I was in my 20s at the time, still a little bit naive. But yeah, so I realized we were being surveilled, but I came to know, of course, later, I suppose we'll get to that in this interview, that I was being surveilled to a much higher degree than I ever imagined possible.
Let's get to that. So, Arnold was your fixer,
yes,
but he was working for the STB, the State Secret Police.
Yes, that actually surprised me when I learned that, and not that it should have surprised me. I should have known a lot better that that stuff was really happening. But yes, when I found out, and also when I found out how high up in the hierarchy of informants he was. He didn't work directly for the STB, but he was a paid informant of the STB and a trusted one, with a very important title. And I didn't realize any of that stuff at the time.
So when did you learn? And how did you learn?
I had a little bit of an inkling in the early 1990s. Do you remember when Ruda Kravo, I believe it was publishing names of people who worked, and one of Arnold's, one of the names there had a code name that reminded me of Arnold's name. I wasn't sure of it at the time, but I remember thinking about it. This might have been 1991 or something, 92, I'm not sure. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my God, could that really be? And then I completely forgot about it until around 2015 or 2014. As you do, sitting in your apartment, just Googling around and thinking, whatever happened to the old gang? So I Googled Arnold's name. And there was very little online. There was very little in the Google search, surprisingly little for a man who worked in media all of his life. He wasn't just my translator. He was a translator for German television. He was a translator for big American magazines like Time. He worked for big newspapers. So
It's a kind of sign, isn't it? I mean, if someone doesn't turn up after Google search.
You know, I later learned that it's a form of statecraft to minimize your digital footprint when you're a working spy. So perhaps that's what he did. But he also passed away in 2000 or 2001, and so a lot of the internet wasn't constructed then, so he might have popped up more. But there was one report from the Prague Military History Institute of Military History here. It was a PDF written 20 pages long, and the headline was something like, you know, Arnold's full name and informant for the STB, for the secret police. And that's when I froze. I thought, oh, shoot, now I gotta learn. So, of course, I poured through this document, very thorough. It's written by an academic at the Institute named Dr. Prokop Tomek. Very nice guy, very learned person, knows a lot about the history of the STB. And so I read that report by him, and I learned so much. And that's when I realized, oh my God, there's a lot of stuff about Arnold in those archives from those days. And if there's anything about Arnold, there's going to be stuff about me. So that put me on a search. I went to the military, the Interior Ministry, to the archives, and I put in applications to see my file, just to see what might be in there. And I was told every time that, you know, Mr. Baker, you don't have a file. There's nothing. And then I talked to Dr. Tomek, and he told me that it's perhaps because Arnold might have enjoyed some type of protection from the top, that his information might have been scrubbed after 1989, and anything that would have been scrubbed would probably have included you in it. So that's it. It's too bad or it's too good, depending on your point of view. But that's how it is.
Actually, back in June, I interviewed Michal Kocáb, if you've heard of him, the musician.
Yes.
And he wrote a book about what happened in November 1989 in Prague. And just, I mean, to put it very, very briefly, he spoke to General Lorenz, who was responsible for STB in 1989.
Right.
And General Lorenz told him, you know, all the important informers, we burnt their files.
Yeah.
What you get today is those who were not so important.
Yes, that's exactly what Tom
and
told me.
That's what probably happened. Yeah.
That's what happened. So, so just to move a little bit forward, during the pandemic, I got an offer from Albatross Publisher here in the Czech Republic to write a book in Czech language, or to publish it in Czech language, about those days that I was traveling to Vienna as a journalist in the 1980s, and then to widen the scope of the book to 1989, and then what happened in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. I wrote the book, and I published it, and of course Dr. Tomek read it, and wrote me an email after it was published and said, guess what? I found your file. So, of course, in the book I wrote...
Shall we sit down?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
In the book, I wrote that based on what I've been told, I don't have a file. Based on what I've been told, I didn't have a file, and so I wrote that in my book in Čas pro mě, and I believed it. I had no reason not to believe it, or it had been destroyed, and so it was a shock when Dr. Tomek showed me that I did have a file, and then once I had a chance to read the file, I was totally blown away.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. In the next part, I'm speaking to Mark Baker about 1990s when he accepted an offer of Prague Post, the first English-language newspaper to be published in Czechoslovakia and later Czechia after 1989. So here you are in the beginning of the 1990s in Prague, and you decide to stay here. What kept you here? What was it like? Was it wild?
Yeah.
Or was it something you expected? Was it something you didn't expect? Were you disappointed, perhaps?
Right. Well, when I first arrived and got the job at the Prague Post, it was thrilling to report on what was going on in this country. We had the breakup of the country that was going to be coming soon already. Tensions between Czechs and Slovaks, yes, were happening. That was the very first edition of the Prague Post. Was a poll, that the majority of people in both parts of the country didn't support a separate state yet. But of course, those polls would change throughout the course of the year and would end up in a split. There was also all kinds of fears of the economic changes with the voucher privatization that you mentioned. That was a risk, really high stakes risk, because that had never really been attempted on a size of the Czech Republic. That would give people shares in companies, and it turned out to be exploited. For certain individuals,
I'm one of
gains.
Suckers, if you will. I
Yeah.
invested all my points into one investment company that kind of dissolved and it disappeared, and I didn't get anything.
Right. So
I don't know, but the majority of people got the same experience. But
what I wanted to say is that there was a lot of tension in the air, and not everything was great after the Velvet Revolution. In fact, there was a lot of worry. Havel himself resigned. He started reciting King Lear, in some quiet corner. He's a president, a king without any country. So all of those things were happening, and then on the same side, thousands of foreigners were coming in, because Prague was so cool, because Havel was so cool, because it was so interesting to be here. So it went from being distressed about what's happening to the state of the Velvet Revolution and its survival. Gorbachev's coup in 1991. Another thing, it's like, wow, this might not last. I mean, it looks like it's going to, but it could be rolled back. To the other side, a happy, crazy place, San Francisco of the 1990s somehow, lots of people just hanging out, doing basically nothing, having fun. And so there were those two tensions, and when people ask me about the influx of the foreigners in the 1990s, wasn't that just a bunch of media hype? Come on, let's get serious. Isn't that just a bunch of nonsense? And it's like, well, in a certain sense, it shifted the narrative about this country, from one of a little bit of worry. I mean, I think your listeners might push back a little bit, but some concern, some real problems that were happening, to a much happier situation where Prague is a beautiful city that everyone knows about. It's a very cool place to go, and I think in a certain sense it had that relatively small contribution, but important contribution. As for me, I love both of those sides. As a news person, we had lots of stories to report on for the Prague Post, and then I decided to get involved in this expat influx myself, and with a few other friends, we opened up a bookstore and a coffee shop in Holešovice called The Globe, which became a kind of epicenter of this thing. People, it was really, it was really grabbed on as a kind of symbol of this whole thing,
that was
basically.
I don't want to exaggerate, but it was a kind of mythic place, the Globe.
Yes,
I have to say.
Something,
Were you inspired by Paris? I mean,
no. Oh, now you're on a really touchy subject.
I am. Yeah.
Just to let your listeners know a little bit.
Thought, probably that you were.
This phrase, this Prague is the left bank of the 1990s, a reference to 1920s Paris. With Ernest Hemingway and Pound and all this very famous literary giants in the English language who settled in Paris during that decade. Alan Levy wrote that in our first edition of the Prague Post. So this was October of 1991, in really gaudy language. Prague is going to be attracting the generation of writers for the next, that are going to be the giants. Of English. Well, it happened, but not as giant. There were a lot of good writers here. A lot of things did happen. I wouldn't want to say anything bad, but of course it was never going to live up to that. So, so when you ask me about the Paris and stuff like that, in a sense, no, we rejected that label. We wanted to do something completely different. We didn't want to be Paris, No,
but perhaps I meant that in a... not in a strictly competitive way. I mean, this was a new space kind of for young people who were interested in writing, in reading, etc. It definitely felt like that, didn't it?
Absolutely.
In the 1990s.
Well, if Czechoslovakia had a reputation in the 1980s, it was a place where there were lots of deep thinkers, writing about it. We mentioned Kundera before, who whatever you think about him now, positive or negative, in the 1980s was a highly influential writer abroad, outside of the country.
Definitely was, yeah.
I read everything and I waited for every book, and just read it as quickly as I could. But then you also had Václav Havel, who was known outside the country also as a thinker. And so there was a certain reputation that the country had, and that carried over into the 1990s. Kafka, we're basically looking right over at his house. People thought about that. As cliched as that might be, look, if these cobblestones can produce some incredible literary wit, maybe there's some gold in those streets. Somehow that can be mined. And I think that sort of excited people who came here to try to do some writing in that. It's a cliche about people who go to an expat place and then write books, but it really happens.
Let me ask you about one thing. I always try to kind of accentuate or to talk about the regions in Czechia and Moravia, in Bohemia, Moravia.
Right.
But it seems to me, justly or unjustly, Prague is the place that really draws people.
In the 1990s, Brno also had a bit of a expat phenomenon. Mm-hmm. People moved there. It wasn't as large as the scene in Prague, but it wasn't small either. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, small numbers of thousands. And to this day, when I introduce myself and they ask me how long you've been here, and I said, well, I came here in the early 90s, and they're like, oh, you're one of the Prague expats, and then I'll ask them and they'll say, I went to Brno first, that gives them cred somehow, that they really went to the real country. They didn't come to this, this place, Prague. And it goes to any other expat, and if you talk to them and they'll say, well, I came to this country, I might live in Prague now, but I first came to, to Moravia or to Teplice or, something like that. And that seems to give them an extra level of authenticity somehow.
What do you think about that? Because I actually remember a friend of mine, Ray Furlong, who works for Radio Free Europe.
Right.
He spent a year in Pardubice. And he told me that it was very kind of rewarding for him because he really learned about the country. That it's not just Prague. But maybe we could, give them a little bit of recognition.
No, I think so. The advantage of moving to Prague for people from outside of this country is that they could get by with relatively little Czech. Mm-hmm. A few words, of course, you need those. But, most people can do some type of interpretation or sign, or many people in Prague, of course, speak English. So, but outside the country, outside the big city, outside the capital city, especially in smaller towns, you really had to use Czech. And I think that pushed them more into that. And of course, you could say better than me, but I have a feeling that, traditions, cultural traditions, etc., they seem to me more important outside of the big cities, it's with all countries.
Yeah, Prague is kind of cosmopolitan, isn't it? Even though, I sort of hesitate because even though I'm from the country, I'm a country boy, I'm a village boy, basically.
Right.
But I like Prague. When I come here, I feel at home,
Right.
But it is cosmopolitan, isn't it?
Right.
I wonder what I even mean by the name, by the word cosmopolitan.
It was more deeply affected by, and also partly because of all those thousands of people who came here in the 1990s. It gave it already an international cast. Mm-hmm. Of course, in 1989, 1990, the city of Prague had almost no international cast, no international profile. And of course, it developed that in the 1990s very rapidly.
Back in 1988, I brought, a friend visited me from the United States, Art Disterheft. He's from California.
Okay.
And we walked around Prague, and it was in summer. Mm-hmm. And you would think, it was in the height of the tourist season.
Right.
Yet we were alone in the streets.
Yeah.
Was that the same experience for you in the 1980s?
Yes. Not alone in the streets, but definitely alone as one of the only foreigners, one of the only people outside of the country, certainly one of the only Westerners in the street in many, many cases. My memory is that, coming here in 1987, 88 for reporting trips, Arnold would take me back to the hotel, in his car after our meeting, say, bye-bye and make the plan for the next day. I would be at the Hotel Intercontinental maybe 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and I'd be like, well, okay, let's see what's going on in Prague in the evening. So I would go out of the hotel, go into the small streets of the old town around Karlova Street and all that area, and those restaurants were filled with Czech students, mostly. So there was a bit of
there was a life.
There was a life there, of course. I never wanted to say that there wasn't. Yeah, and in some places, you would try to get a table, and they would the waiter would tell you that it was reserved or it was full. You couldn't do it. Whether it was or not is another story. But there certainly was a nightlife, that was going on in Prague.
What I meant was we went, if I remember correctly, for example, to Střelecký ostrov, near the National Theatre.
Right.
And, there was... Probably somebody was there. I'm not saying, that it was completely deserted.
Yes.
But my friend from the United States was kind of surprised, this beautiful setting and so few people around.
I had, I told you the story about coming to Prague in 1984 with my roommate, Matt, and then looking for him, who was lost, and going through Old Town and Dlouhá Street around Old Town and all those streets there. It felt so empty. Maybe I was paranoid a little bit, but looking around, and this was August of 1984, and it was that kind of emptiness where you could hear your own steps, steps. And we were right downtown. This was not in some, far-flung neighborhood or anything like that. And so, yeah, you're right. There was a lot of, it was nothing like what it is now. Nothing.
I read some stuff that you wrote about Slovenia and some other places.
Sure.
What? And I'm not asking now as a kind of patriot or nationalist or something.
Into a dangerous question.
Why?
Where is Prague?
No. I'm not asking you whether Prague is number 1 or number 2 or number 3. What I would like to ask you is,
right,
what makes Prague different? What makes Prague unique?
What makes Prague unique? I think what makes Prague unique is the fact that...
Maybe it's not unique.
No, it's definitely unique. What makes Prague unique is the fact that the city itself, the cityscape of itself, is not something that most visitors will have ever seen before. They're used to cityscapes of the 20th century or 21st century or the 19th century, but Prague is 14th century in many respects. And when people see an entire city core center built around very old buildings, and it's a capital city. It's not like, a tourist city. It's not Bruges or something, It's a shocker. And the fact that it goes on and on and on. If you go from the Powder Tower in the old town and go down Siletna, of course, the old royal route, you have to go out on Charles Bridge, and then you're not done with it. You go to Malstrana, and then you climb that long thing to Neruda, and then you get to the castle. So it's 2 or 3 kilometers long of this historic core. So the size of this historic mass is really surprising. So that's Prague for visitors. That's the thing.
And there's no other city. Of course, you mentioned, for example, Bruges.
Right.
There are places like that, but not as.
Well,
probably.
no. A lot of places, of course, Prague's not the oldest city in Europe, and wasn't the only city that was built up in the 14th century and all that other stuff. But it was one of the cities that somehow was forgotten for so many centuries, that no significant building was really done here. Of course, now your listener's going to play. That's crazy, because of course, later styles like Baroque and Renaissance did come to Prague, and of course, then Art Nouveau and all that stuff. But what I'm saying is that the city was never really ripped up, like Paris was. We're staying...
Paris was under Baron Haussmann, as the French call him. They completely uprooted, the medieval Paris, and they built new boulevards and everything.
Yes.
And that didn't happen in Prague, because it was a provincial city. It wasn't Vienna.
It was a provincial city. In order to carry out these large public works projects, you had to, of course, apply to Vienna. They were very careful with how they expended their resources, and Prague only got a relatively small amount. We're standing right here, and of course, this was going to be a huge boulevard, right? Like Pařížka was going to go all the way that way, and that was never built for whatever reason.
That never happened. Yeah. I don't want to draw parallels that are perhaps out of place, but someone told me in London that Budapest and Vienna are children of the 19th century, are the cities of the 19th century. Exactly, because that was the capital, and Budapest at that time was on par with Vienna.
Yes, right.
And that didn't happen in Prague.
Right.
And in a way, I studied in Olomouc, which was a small provincial town.
Right.
And it has a very compact center, exactly because it was a provincial town. Because the Industrial Revolution didn't cause,
that's what I mean. Major upheaval.
Yeah.
Like Olomouc is one of the few other relatively large cities where you get that same feeling, right? I mean, when I walk through central Olomouc, I'm like, wow, this is so amazing. I'm in a set piece for some, I don't know, 17th century drama or something like that, all those Baroque churches and everything. Yeah. And Český Krumlov, you could mention the other town that somehow wasn't really, I mean, the outskirts were, of course, but the inner part of the city wasn't touched by modernity. Prague was touched, I don't want to give that impression, but not overly touched.
But let's not be too nice to Prague.
Okay.
Okay? As we are talking here, I mean, Prague is obviously a major tourist center, a lot of things.
Right.
I interviewed, among other people, for example, Jan Kassel, who's now the president of the Czech Chamber of Architecture.
Okay.
And he used to be the mayor of Prague. And he's quite critical about, all the tourist shops and, I mean, that really is something that's not nice about Prague, is it?
Look, there's a balance between enough tourists and too many tourists or whatever, because of course tourism is very, very important to Prague. I've read statistics about how many tens of millions of euros it brings into the city every year, how many 1 in 10 jobs or something is dependent on tourism. So tourism is, like it or hate it, it's something that Prague can't quit. Yeah, Prague, it's a drug Prague can't quit, actually. So they have to manage it, and that's where we're at this stage right now. We're trying to manage tourism, and of course, tourism is a beast. How do you manage millions of people? How do you manage airports? How do you manage people's travel plans? How do you manage all the dealers down in Old Town Square, the legal ones and the illegal ones? I mean, it's tough. It's hard. So I sympathize with Prague, and it's gotten too big in terms of tourism in the last few years, I think. Before COVID and now in the first year after the pandemic that tourism really came back.
I should have asked you right at the beginning, are you a New Yorker?
No, I grew up in Ohio in the Midwest.
In Ohio?
Yeah. I grew up in Ohio in the
My
Midwest.
son actually spent nearly a year in Circleville, Ohio, near Columbus.
I was interviewed another time. This not to leave this out. But the interviewer then told me that he spent a year in another very small town in Ohio, Washington
I actually
Courthouse.
checked it. He went there in 2017, so I checked the public information.
Yeah.
About 78 or 84% of the people voted for Donald Trump in Circleville, Ohio.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I mean, this is just this is the Trump land.
Yeah, Trump. That is Trump country.
And, I'm sorry, I got completely out of out of line for the interview.
Yeah.
So you came to New York. You studied in New York.
Yeah.
And then is it over dramatic to say you fell in love with Prague, or you became kind of close with Prague?
I went to school.
Just wonder why.
That's a really, really good question. I think I got attracted to Prague because of all the historical changes that were going on, and also the fact that I had seen the city before everybody from outside of Prague had seen the city. Of course, there were many people living here that saw it way before me.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? It's like I got to see a different side of Prague, and I really love that side of Prague. Quiet beauty, a very peaceful city, and then I just got sucked into that history thing. Like so much fascinating stuff is happening now. And then you start building your life. I didn't stay in Prague the entire time I was here. I went back to New York, tried to resurrect my journalism career, which I thought was floundering in Prague after so many years, or after several years. And then I worked for Bloomberg in New York, for the Bloomberg company in New York City. And then I came back in 1997, I want to say 1998, something like that, and then started working at Radio Free Europe and got back to Prague. But by that time had already gotten into my bloodstream. I tried to leave. I tried to make it work in New York, but I had the bookstore, of course, or I had part of the bookstore that I was always worrying about, and I had to get back for that. But part of me was just like, you had such a great experience in Prague, you know. I mean, even New York couldn't match it at that time.
Are you going to stay here, you think?
I am not planning on leaving, if that's what you mean. Not yet. I own an apartment in Prague. I have, my life here, and I have my blog here. I want to adapt my book into English, so I have things that I want to do here, and I think.
Mm-hmm. So you are planning to stay?
Yeah, I'm planning to stay.
Foreseeable future. Tell me about the book. I'm sorry. No.
No, it's fine. But I wanted to say that one of the great benefits of writing a book. That you don't think about when you start out to write the book, but you realize afterwards, is that you process so much material. In my case, I process so many memories, so many stories, so many photos, so many pictures, anecdotes, all kinds of information, so that I no longer feel that I have to stay here, if you know what I mean. Like somehow I've done it somehow, like I've almost finished it in a way. And I don't want to say that I'm going to be leaving Prague or anything like that, but it gave me it gave me the feeling like I don't have to deal with the past as much as I used to. I don't even have to think about that anymore, and I can go forward.
You kind of dealt with it.
You deal with it. Yeah, you deal with it in the book. Somehow. Now people have asked for the English book because it was published in Czech. So I have to go back into those memories again and reprocess it in a different language, in my own language. But
so
yeah.
When is it coming out?
Oh, it's not. I have to get to it yet. The problem with that is that I wrote the book before I found my file. So Chess.men doesn't have any of that new information in it about Operation Inter and all that stuff. So now what I want to do is reweave the spy narrative back into the book and maybe even reconfigure the focus of the book to be more on that subject, because I think that's what readers are interested in learning.
So that was Mark Baker, a journalist, travel writer and author, speaking to me in Letná in Prague. My next guest will be Matouš Glanz, a Czech scientist and director of Czechspats, an organization that he will introduce himself.
Czechspats is a network of the Czech science diaspora, of Czech scientists around the world, and those that come back to Czechia with an international experience. And the mission of the organization, apart from building this community and supporting this community, mission is then to transfer the international experience of this community to the Czech system and to change this somewhat closed culture of the Czech science to make it more global.
I think you already indicated that, but do you think it's still kind of the baggage of the years of communism, of the decades of communism?
To a large extent, yes. I think this historical memory is quite long, and I think it is
because
still
I would think
rooted there.
Already there's one generation of scientists already grew up.
Yeah, but the people in charge, the people in the top management at the highest positions, they were still brought up in that time, or if they were educated after communism already fell, their teachers grew up in that system and didn't know anything else. So there's this self-propagating mechanism where when something deeply embedded in the system doesn't change even in 10 years.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Czechast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please consider following or liking the podcast on your favorite platform. And if you know someone who's interested in Czech culture, history, or the unique perspectives of life in Czechia, be sure to tell them about Czechast. This is Vít Pohanka signing off for Radio Prague International. Thanks for listening and stay curious.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.